good evening, and welcome. Tonight I'm going to be reading to you this book about Great Zimbabwe. It's by Martin Hall and Rebecca Steffoff. Let's learn more about this really cool ancient site in Zimbabwe, which is where the country of Zimbabwe got its name from, after this place. The Great Zimbabwe. This one's right now. And there's a cool timeline of history, but here's a really cool map. So here's where Great Zimbabwe is located in Zimbabwe. And this is a map of the site. So I'll try to explain it. We have like this big like hill right here. And there's sites up there. And down here there are lots and lots and lots of houses. Right here is the Great Enclosure. There's a big map of it right there, but we're going to learn about all of these throughout the book. That's like a good visual of where everything is. Let's start here with encounters. In the 14th and 15th centuries, the city of Kilwa on the East African coast was a thriving trade center with as many as 20,000 inhabitants. The people of Kilwa traded cloth from the local weaving industry for gold from the African interior, glass beads from India, and fine pottery from China. Dhows, triangular-shaped ships that crossed the Indian Ocean, crowded Kilwa's harbor. But one day in 1505, a different sort of fleet arrived. Its 22 European ships carried 1,500 soldiers commanded by Viceroy Francisco de Almeida of Portugal, under orders from his king to seize Kilwa. Squeaky chair. East Africans had seen such ships before. Just 6 years earlier, the Portuguese navigator Vasco da Gama, the first European to sail around the tip of Africa, had landed at several East African ports on his way to India. Returning to Portugal, he had told the king about the prosperity and safe harbors of these trading ports. Portugal wanted some of those ports to expand its trading empire. Look at this cool little map. Big ol' elephant. After Almeida's fleet arrived, the sheik who ruled Kilwa fled. The Portuguese replaced him with a sheik they could control, then set about tightening their grip on Kilwa and other ports, especially Sofala to the south in what is now Mozambique. Their arrival launched an era of European conquest and colonization in the region. It also began the Europeans' long and frustrating quest for the mythical civilizations they thought lay hidden in the African interior. The Europeans never found the places they sought, but in time they came upon the lasting monument of a former African civilization, the massive city of Great Zimbabwe. With masterfully built stone walls snaking across a rocky ridge and walls and towers dotting the plain below, Great Zimbabwe would become a source of mysteries and controversies for those who heard about it and explored it in the years to come. You can't tell what this is, that's like a path, and these are the huge walls between. The Portuguese took a keen interest in the gold from the African interior that reached the coastal markets. They were eager to discover, and if possible, control the sources of that gold. In 1512, Antonio Fernandez led an expedition from Sofala in search of a rumored gold-producing region called Monomotapa. A few other expeditions followed during the 16th and early 17th centuries. Portuguese soldiers and adventurers, sometimes burdened with heavy armor, toiled inland through the African heat, battling disease as well as the local warriors who tried to defend their homeland from the intruders. These explorers and native traders passed on tales suggesting that somewhere in the interior was a kingdom rich in gold, where kings lived in stone houses. In 1552, a Portuguese historian named João de Barros described a square fortress of masonry within and without, built of stones of marvelous size, and a nearby stone tower, both built without mortar. The entire place, according to Barros, was royal property and guarded by a nobleman. Writing around the same time, another historian named Damião de Gois claimed that the king of Monomotapa keeps great state and is served on bended knee with reverence. A century later, an English geographer named John Ogilvy wrote that the palace of Monomotapa was covered over with plates of gold. These stories were inspired by the myth of Prester John, whom Europeans imagined to be a rich and powerful Christian emperor living on the fringe of the known world. Whenever European explorers heard of a mighty kingdom beyond the horizon, they thought they were on the verge of finding him at last. The Portuguese in Sofala never found the wealthy realms they imagined. A few adventurers, however, did come into brief contact with Mutapa and Torwa, interior states that mined and traded gold and built impressive stone structures. Writing of these encounters, Portuguese historians speculated that the large stone buildings and cities in the interior of southeastern Africa had been built long ago as outposts of ancient cultures mentioned in the Bible. In 1609, João de Santos, who had been a missionary in Mutapa, wrote a book linking the African stone buildings with old biblical stories about King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. Santos's idea proved long-lived. Mutapa and Toro were the most recent in a series of states that had risen to power on the Zimbabwe Plateau, a rolling highland plain between the Zambezi and Limpopo rivers. The population centers of Mutapa and Tora ranged from settlements of just a few families to good-sized regional cities. The largest and most impressive was the city that the Portuguese referred to as Zimbabwe, and that we now call Great Zimbabwe. A few Portuguese who reached Great Zimbabwe arrived after its 300-year history as Africa's largest city south of the Sahara Desert had come to a close. By that time, Great Zimbabwe no longer occupied a central place in the affairs of the African peoples of the Zimbabwe Plateau, and to the outside world it was only a fading rumor. As the centuries passed, European map makers who remembered old hills sometimes drew cities or castles on their maps. Their maps of southeastern Africa. I lost my place looking at this cool map. But these were as fanciful as the images of sea monsters and whirlpools that also adorned their work. By the 19th century, European missionaries and settlers were moving north onto the Zimbabwe Plateau from what is now South Africa. A German missionary named Alexander Merensky gathered and passed on stories about a vast ruined stone city in the interior, a ruin that he thought might be Ophir, a city mentioned in the biblical accounts of Solomon and Sheba. Karl Mauch, a German geologist seeking fortune and fame in Africa and had a really crazy beard, listened eagerly to Merensky's theories. In 1871, Mauch went looking for the ruins of Old Monomotapa or Ophir, as he wrote in his diary. Tall, heavily bearded, clad in a suit of antelope hide that he made himself, and carrying a large umbrella, several guns, and more than 50 pounds of gear, including books and painting equipment, Mauch trudged into a territory called Mashonaland. There he met another German, an ivory dealer named Adam Renders, who said he knew of the ruins. With the help of Renders and a local guide, Mauch found Great Zimbabwe. To Mauch's disappointment, he found no gold or jewels, nor did he find written inscriptions that might offer clues about the city's builders or its history. Still, Mauch had no doubt that the ruins were those of the biblical city Ophir. He cut a sliver of wood from a beam in one ruin. Thinking that the wood was cedar, he decided that the beam must have come from Lebanon, mentioned in the Bible as Solomon's source of cedar. From this shaky starting point, Mauch's imagination made another bold leap, and he identified the ruin as the Queen of Sheba's palace. Mauch returned to Germany, where his announcement revived the old idea that far-ranging Near Eastern people had been active in southern Africa centuries earlier. This idea appealed to late 19th century Europeans for several reasons. They were familiar with the monumental stone architecture of the Near East, such as the Egyptians' Great Pyramids, and to many it seemed logical to link the only stone ruins south of the Sahara Desert with these well-known ancient builders. The primary reason, though, stemmed from racial prejudice. Europeans were colonizing southern Africa, seizing land from native peoples such as the Shona and Zulu. To justify their actions, white politicians, soldiers, and settlers needed to believe that they were superior to the black Africans. They could not accept that black Africans, whom they were accustomed to regarding as savages, had built the large, well-made stone structures. As word of Mouch's find spread, treasure hunters descended on the ruins to dig for gold. They destroyed archaeological evidence, littered the area with broken liquor bottles and old boots, and were rewarded with small amounts of gold. In 1890, Mashonaland came under the control of Cecil Rhodes, a British financier who organized the British South Africa Company to establish a colony there. Fascinated with Great Zimbabwe, Rhodes sponsored new excavations of the site, aimed at unearthing both treasure and knowledge. Theodore Bent, who had the support of two leading British scientific organizations, the Royal Geographic Society and the British Association for the Advancement of Science, led the first scientific study. Bent had specialized in the study of the Phoenicians, an ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern people. He thought at first that the African interior had little to offer an archaeologist. The ruins of Great Zimbabwe, he claimed, were African and not very ancient. Then he came upon some of the most striking artifacts ever found at the site. Large birds carved from stone sitting atop stone pillars. These reminded Bent of ancient Mediterranean and Near Eastern artifacts. Soon he had decided that the ruins were not African after all. Arabs, he claimed, had built them, but he also detected, perhaps not surprisingly, a Phoenician influence. A journalist named Richard N. Hall, whom Rhodes's company placed in charge of the ruins, wrote the next chapter in the mythology of Great Zimbabwe. Hall worked there from 1901 to 1904, to the lasting regret of later experts. His methods were forceful and destructive. In the course of restoring the ruins to what he thought had been the former appearance, Hall cleared away layer upon layer of deposits that would have given much valuable information to careful scientific researchers. In his report to Rhodes, Hall echoed Bent's verdict, saying that one of the more civilized races of the ancient world, Arabs or Near Easterners, had built Great Zimbabwe. Thanks to people such as Bent and Hall, the non-African origin of the ruins became established as their official history. As early as 1905, however, an archaeologist named David Randall McIver lifted the veils of myth and racism. After close examination of the ruins, Randall McIver announced that Great Zimbabwe was unquestionably African in every detail. Randall McIver was right, but the white colonial establishment rejected his views. Most people were simply not ready to accept the idea that a skilled and powerful civilization had arisen in Black Africa. They found other theories more attractive, and there were plenty of them. Various theories gave credit to Great Zimbabwe to ancient Egyptians, shipwrecked Vikings, and even the mythical lost civilization of Atlantis. Look at this. This is probably my favorite part of the Great Zimbabwe, this big tower. Anyway, Gertrude Caton Thompson, a skilled archaeologist whom the British Association for the Advancement of Science sent to Great Zimbabwe in 1929 to examine the site anew, filed letters about the most absurd crackpot theories under insane. Caton Thompson's careful study employed stratigraphy. Let's go for stratigraphy, one of the cornerstones of modern archaeology. Stratigraphy is the study of layers of soil. Deeper layers are older than the layers above them. By meticulously measuring the depth of everything found at a site, archaeologists can develop a chronology or sequence of events across time for the site. Caton Thompson concluded in Zimbabwe Culture, her report on her investigation, that Great Zimbabwe was the relic of a native civilization of originality and amazing industry. Although she suggested that Arab or Near Eastern traders who visited the coastal cities of East Africa might have influenced the site's African builders, her main finding was clear. Great Zimbabwe was African, and it was much more recent than the ancient cultures of biblical legend. Still, the old colonial myths about Great Zimbabwe's non-African origins have lingered for years. All experts, however, now accept the scientific evidence that Africans built and occupied the sites that gave the modern nation of Zimbabwe its name, which comes from the Shona phrase Zimbabwe, meaning honored houses, or Zimbabwe, houses of stone. Houses of stone. Great Zimbabwe's name refers to houses of stone, but the site contains no houses in the ordinary sense of the word. Instead, massive stone walls snake across the landscape, enclosing areas both large and small. Piles of tumbled stones mark the places where other walls once stood. These enclosures and walls are the remains of the city that once dominated the Zimbabwe Plateau. Great Zimbabwe is in south-central Zimbabwe, 17 miles southeast of the town of Masvingo, in an area where climate and resources were favorable to settlers. The site is more than 3,000 feet above sea level, cooler than the hot coastal plain. It is free of the tsetse fly, which in many parts of Africa infects both humans and livestock with disease-causing parasites. Let you look at the pictures while I read. The plateau's grassy plains are ideal for cattle grazing, and its scattered trees and forests provided the builders of Great Zimbabwe with timber for fuel and construction. Granite hills and rock outcroppings yielded gold, iron, copper, and tin. Equally important was the granite itself, which cracks in a process that geologists call exfoliation. The change in temperature between the warm days and chilly nights causes the rocks to split into natural building blocks, flat-sided slabs between 3 and 7 inches thick. The people of the plateau learned to speed up the production of these slabs by heating the surface of the granite with fire and then cooling it suddenly with water. Many thousands of stones went into the building of Great Zimbabwe. The sprawling site covers about 1,800 acres, which archaeologists have divided into 3 general areas: the hill, the valley, and the outer city. The first site that greets visitors is the hill. Its steep sides rise 260 feet above the surrounding landscape, and its summit is crowned with many rock formations. Walls run between natural outcrops and boulders, creating a network of small passageways and enclosures. Like all structures at Great Zimbabwe, these are open to the sky. Archaeologists have found no evidence that the site's stone structures had roofs. Instead, the enclosures are thought to have contained small thatched roof structures made of daka, a type of soil containing clay and gravel that is common African building material. There's the hill. Large pits near Great Zimbabwe provided daka for the site. At one end of the hill is a walled area called the Eastern Enclosure that once held many monoliths or standing stones and pillars. The tops of some of these pillars were carved as birds, which may have represented individual rulers of Great Zimbabwe. From the Eastern Enclosure, a narrow passage climbs between boulders up to the balcony, the highest enclosure on the hill. It offers a view down over the Eastern Enclosure and below it the spreading valley. About 200 feet away is the larger Western Enclosure, ringed by 2 curving stone walls that are 26 feet at their highest point and 16 feet at their widest. There's Gertrude Caton Thompson. These walls, like many at Great Zimbabwe, are really 2 walls in one, an inner and an outer wall made of slabs laid in courses or layers with loose stone, dirt, and gravel filling the space between them. The slabs fit snugly together without the use of mortar. Monoliths and turrets once stood at intervals along the top of the Western Enclosure's walls. Within the enclosure, excavators have found layers of daka floors, broken pottery, and other signs that the site was continuously occupied for many years. Most archaeologists today believe that the hill was the seat of royal power in Great Zimbabwe. The Western Enclosure probably housed kings or chiefs. The Eastern Enclosure may have been a religious or ritual place where sacred emblems or symbolic objects such as the monoliths and carved birds were displayed. South of the hill lies the valley. It contains about a dozen enclosures ringed or partly ringed by stone walls. Several major archaeological projects at Great Zimbabwe have focused on these ruins. In 1929, Gertrude Caton Thompson methodically excavated one of them and correctly concluded that it was African in origin and that it dated from the medieval, not the ancient period. In another enclosure, which Hall excavated in 1903, was a great hoard of artifacts. The valley enclosures tell a story in stonework of Great Zimbabwe's rise and decline. The architect Anthony Whitty studied these enclosures in the 1950s and identified 3 main construction styles, each from a different phase of Great Zimbabwe's history. The oldest phase features crude stonework, untrimmed stones laid in irregular or uneven courses. This phase probably began around 1300. During the second phase, during the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe's builders produced their finest walls, using stones that had been carefully trimmed to fit neatly together and layering them in even courses, sometimes setting them in decorative patterns, such as zigzags or chevrons, a V-shaped design. During the third phase in the 15th century, the quality of stonework declined for unknown reasons. Walls were made of irregularly sized stones, sometimes piled crudely together or forcefully wedged into place. The focal point of the valley is the largest African stone ruin south of the Sahara Desert. Known as the Great Enclosure, this oval space is surrounded by an 800-foot-long wall, 32 feet high and 17 feet thick in places. The massive wall is thicker at the bottom than at the top, making it very stable. Along part of the enclosure, an inner wall runs parallel to the main wall, with a deep, narrow passageway between the two. This passageway leads to the Great Enclosure's most striking feature, the conical tower. This solid cone-shaped structure is 30 feet high and 18 feet across at the base. The Great Enclosure also contains a number of smaller enclosures and dhaka platforms. The riddle of Rhodesia. There we go. The purpose of the Great Enclosure, like much else about Great Zimbabwe, has been widely debated. Various investigators have identified it as a temple, the residence of the king's wives, or a private community set aside for members of the royal court or other elite citizens. The archaeologist Thomas Huffman has suggested that the Great Enclosure may have been a school where young women underwent training and rituals to prepare them for initiation into adult society. He bases this suggestion on the fact that some African cultures in the region maintain such schools today and have done so for generations. Beyond the valley enclosures is the outer city, the least known part of the site. Once the densely crowded home of most of Great Zimbabwe's inhabitants, today consists mostly of the remains of dhaka huts, with occasional stone enclosures scattered around about the countryside, the surrounding countryside. Well, based on his examination of the site, Huffman has estimated that Great Zimbabwe could have housed as many as 18,000 people at its peak, making it a true urban center in the midst of medieval southern Africa. When Europeans encountered Great Zimbabwe in the late 19th century, they felt an awe inspired by their mistaken ideas about the mysterious and exotic origins of the ruins. Modern archaeology has given us a more accurate view of Great Zimbabwe's origins and history, but the site remains as impressive and as ever a massive memorial to the African past that is still being uncovered. The Zimbabwean government administers Great Zimbabwe as a national monument, and in 1986, the United Nations Educational, Scientific, and Cultural Organization, or UNESCO, named Great Zimbabwe a World Heritage Site in recognition of its unique and valuable place in cultural and archaeological history. Reading the evidence. What was life like for the people of Great Zimbabwe? How did they work, worship, and organize their society? The Great Zimbabwe people left no written records, so archaeologists look to other sources for information about their lives. Two of the most important sources are the physical objects that the Great Zimbabweans left behind, and the stories that their modern descendants tell. Some physical objects found at Great Zimbabwe are rare and special artifacts that probably had great importance during the city's heyday. Many are the ordinary relics of everyday life, such as garbage, pottery, and tools. Animal bones, for example, have drawn the attention of archaeozoologists, I believe, specialists in the animal life associated with archaeological sites. They study the kinds of animals found at a site, the number of each kind, and, when possible, the date and condition of the remains. The remains at Great Zimbabwe and nearby sites reveal that cattle was the basis of the economy. Cattle were more than food. They also served as a form of wealth and a sign of status. People in outlying low-status settlements, such as villages and farms, hunted for wild game to supplement their diet of grain. They also kept cattle and other livestock, but the bones from the best cuts of meat have only been found within the larger Mad Zimbabwe, or stone enclosures. It appears that the ordinary folk did not consume the prime cattle, but rather turns them over to the elites, the powerful and privileged classes who lived in the Mad Zimbabwe. Archaeologists also learn much from artifacts, homemade objects such as utensils and artworks. Pots are an important and useful kind of artifact. Not only do they offer insight into how they might have been used in everyday life, but they can often be dated by stylistic features such as shape, decoration, or material. In spite of the reckless and destructive methods of early excavators, Great Zimbabwe has yielded many examples of pottery, both whole pots and the broken pieces known as potsherds. Great Zimbabwe pots are round and fall into two general types. Most are between 9 and 12 inches across with short, slightly narrow necks, some with lids. The others are much larger, with 3 or 4 times the capacity of the smaller pots. The archaeologist Peter S. Garlick points out in his book Great Zimbabwe that the smaller vessels are similar to those of the Shona people, descendants of the Great Zimbabweans used today for drinking. The larger ones resemble pots that the Shona use for brewing beer or storing food. All the Great Zimbabwe pots were formed from lengths of local clay, wound and coiled into shape and then baked in a wood fire. Among other everyday objects found at the site are hundreds of discs between 1 and 2 inches across, with small holes in their centers. Some are made of pottery, others smooth, shiny grayish-green rock known as soapstone, which is fairly soft and easy to carve. Archaeologists do not know for certain what purpose these discs served. Some believed that they were spindle wheels, weights placed on the ends of spindle rods used to spin cotton fiber into thread. The Shona have been known to use similar discs for that purpose. Others have suggested that the Great Zimbabwean discs may have been game pieces or dice used in fortune-telling. The site also contained many metal workers' tools, such as iron ore, and objects such as arrowheads, axe heads, and hoe blades made of local iron, as well as iron, copper, gold, and bronze wire and beads. These finds show that the people of Great Zimbabwe practiced metalworking on a large scale. Here's the birds. Zimbabwe birds. Many archaeologists think that Great Zimbabwe contributed gold and other metals to the Indian Ocean trade. Not just metal, but luxury items such as gold and copper, wire, and beads made by Great Zimbabwean artisans. Objects found at Great Zimbabwe show that the city was part of a far-reaching trade network. In 1903, Richard N. Hall found a varied collection of objects, some of which, such as painted glass from Syria and a small bowl from Iran, had originated far from the Zimbabwe plateau. Hall's find also included many pieces of Chinese celadon ware, a type of pale green pottery. Later, Gertrude Caton Thompson found many small glass beads in a rubbish heap below the western enclosure. Among Great Zimbabwe's best-known and most distinctive artifacts are the Zimbabwe birds. Early investigators found 7 soapstone sculptures of birds, and part of an 8th, at various parts of the site. Each bird is about 14 inches tall and sits atop a 3-foot column. Each has a unique design. Some are decorated with circles on their wings, others with zigzag patterns on their columns, or some other distinct feature. Nothing closely resembling these sculptures has been found at any other archaeological site, and their meaning cannot be known for certain. Thomas Huffman, however, thinks that the birds may have represented the spirits of Zimbabwe's kings, who were both political and religious figures. Huffman's interpretation of Great Zimbabwe draws upon the stories, legends, myths, and traditions, what researchers call ethnography, of the Shona people. This approach views an ancient site through the lens of the modern culture that is most closely linked to it. Ethnography is a valuable tool that can offer many clues about how ancient people might have viewed the world and organized their lives. It has limitations, however. The stories that people tell change over time and do not always accurately report events. Archaeologists use the ethnographic approach cautiously, trying to draw on as many sources as possible for balance. In the case of Great Zimbabwe, Huffman has proposed an interpretation of the site based on the beliefs and rituals of the present-day Venda people, who now live south of the Limpopo River. Huffman believes the Venda people, closely related to the Shona builders of Great Zimbabwe, are closely related to the Shona builders of Great Zimbabwe. He also draws on the worldview revealed in Shona oral tradition. In the Shona religion, male and female symbols and spaces are kept separate. He also points out that paired male and female architectural sites and symbols are part of Venda culture. Huffman sees evidence of this division in the architecture of Great Zimbabwe, where doors, pathways, and towers often occur in pairs. To Huffman, certain structures, notably the western enclosure on the hill and the conical tower in the great enclosure, display male symbols such as monoliths and spears. Other structures, such as part of the great enclosure's wall and the cleft rock enclosure on the hill, display female symbols, including snakes and V-shaped stone patterns. Not all agree with this interpretation. Zimbabwean scholar David Beach, for example, has argued that Huffman relies too much on recent Shona myths, and that the Venda culture is not as similar to Great Zimbabwean culture as Huffman claims. Although ethnographic interpretations of Great Zimbabwe and the other stone enclosures of the Zimbabwe Plateau may never be as matter-of-fact as bones and potsherds, they open up new possibilities for envisioning the way the builders and inhabitants of these sites saw their world and their roles in it. A Shona Empire. Great Zimbabwe's massive stonework is a sign that the city was an important place with a sophisticated political and social system. Now that myths about the city's exotic origins have been swept away, archaeologists and historians have begun to draw its true story forth from the physical evidence found at the site and from careful study of additional sources, such as Old Portuguese accounts of trade and exploration and African oral traditions. As a result, a picture has emerged of Great Zimbabwe's place in the flow of history in southern Africa. Before Great Zimbabwe, there was Mapungubwe. Like Great Zimbabwe, Mapungubwe was a city, the center of a vibrant culture. There's the rhino. Mapungubwe was strategically located in the valley of the Limpopo River south of Great Zimbabwe, commanding access to the grazing lands and trade routes. The people of Mapungubwe built enclosures on hilltops, made pottery, herded cattle, and traded ivory and gold with the coastal ports 400 miles away. By the end of the 13th century, Mapungubwe had become an important center of political and economic power, one of a number of such regional centers in the interior of southeastern Africa. Mapungubwe's influence expanded northward across the Limpopo and into the Zimbabwe Plateau. Here, people began building stone enclosures at new sites. After 1300, the center of political and economic power shifted from Mapungubwe to Zimbabwe. Some scholars think changes in the Indian Ocean trade may have caused the shift. Ivory had been Mapungubwe's main export and source of wealth, but evidence recovered from burials and trade ports suggests that the demand for gold began to grow. Ivory remained valuable, but gold was increasingly prized. The best sources of gold lay in the hills of the Zimbabwe Plateau, and Great Zimbabwe was closer to them than Mapungubwe. Mapungubwe began to decline as Great Zimbabwe's fortunes rose. Great Zimbabwe was not an isolated urban center. It was the largest of 30 or 40 regional centers scattered across the plateau from the Kalahari Desert in the west to the Indian Ocean lowlands in the east. Most of these centers shared Great Zimbabwe's distinctive architectural style, although none was as large, and they shared the same culture and economy. They were probably ruled from Great Zimbabwe by regional governors who collected tribute or taxes in the form of gold and other goods from the local people. In addition to these regional centers, the Zimbabwe civilization included many smaller settlements from villages to single farmsteads. Hear that dog in the back? Okay, anyway. In the 14th century, Great Zimbabwe controlled gold production on the Zimbabwe Plateau. The Zimbabweans had several methods of extracting gold. They panned for gold, shifting water and gravel from stream beds to obtain loose flakes and nuggets of gold that had been washed out of deposits of ore. The Zimbabweans also mined gold ore out of hard rock by digging horizontal, slanted, and vertical mine shafts, some reaching depths of more than 80 feet. Broken skeleton bones found in some of these shafts offer mute evidence that mining was a hazardous occupation. Great Zimbabwe dominated the gold trade between the interior and Swahili ports such as Sofala on the eastern coast. The Swahili traders then shipped Zimbabwean gold to ports farther north along the coast. Along these was the Great Emporium, or trade center, at Kilwa. Arab traders from the Red Sea visited Kilwa, linking it to Egypt, the Mediterranean, Arabia, and the Near East, while Indian Ocean traders brought goods from as far away as China. The Swahili traders exchanged these imported goods for gold mined on the Zimbabwe plateau. The archaeological evidence shows that wealth was accumulated at Great Zimbabwe and that it was not evenly distributed among the population. Highly valued items such as gold and imported goods are found almost entirely inside the stone enclosures, rarely in the ruins of outlying residences. The uneven distribution of wealth echoes other signs that society was divided into different classes. Houses outside the enclosures were smaller, less substantial, and more closely crowded together than those inside them. Cattle, especially young cattle, were eaten or used in sacrificial rituals inside the enclosures. In contrast, the diet of people living outside the enclosures consisted largely of sheep, goats, and game. In addition, Great Zimbabwe's long-distance trade and its large-scale building program show that it was an organized state, not simply a large village. Major construction at Great Zimbabwe seems to have ended around 1450. By that time, the quality of stonework had declined from its earlier high standard, and the city itself had begun to lose its importance as a center of trade and government. Here's the Zimbabwe flag, and it has a Zimbabwe bird on it. Archaeologists and historians have suggested several reasons for this decline. Great Zimbabwe was losing its importance in the trade network. Gold production was down. Much of the easily obtainable gold had been stripped from the region, and areas to the north and west were becoming important as new sources of both copper and gold. But Great Zimbabwe's economy had been based on cattle before the rise of the gold trade. Why couldn't the city continue to thrive on a cattle-based economy? Some investigators think that the landscape could no longer support the city's large population. Huge herds of cattle had overgrazed the grasslands. Most nearby timber had been cut down. A series of droughts may have struck the area, increasing the stress of an already overburdened environment. Whatever the reason, Great Zimbabwe declined in importance, probably slowly and over a century or longer. The Shona people of the region formed two new states, the successors to Great Zimbabwe. In the west was Torwa, whose capital city, Kami, had stone walls much like those of Great Zimbabwe. Some scholars think that the square fortress of masonry within and without, built of stones of marvelous size, that Portuguese historian João de Barros described in 1552 was Kami, not Great Zimbabwe. The other successor state, Rosui, existed for many decades in and around the area of Great Zimbabwe. The arrival of the Portuguese in East Africa in the 16th century brought instability to the Swahili coast and the Zimbabwe plateau. After taking control of Kilwa in 1505, the Portuguese tried to take over the gold trading routes in the interior. They never fully succeeded, but their efforts sparked resistance and war. Constant fighting and the rise of local warlords disrupted trade along routes that had been used for centuries. Ironically, the Portuguese search for gold broke the links between the gold-producing interior and the coastal ports. The flow of wealth to the interior stopped. In the centuries that followed, the Shona people of the Zimbabwe plateau suffered slave raids from the coast and invasions by African peoples from the south. Even before the arrival of the Portuguese, Great Zimbabwe's economic and political importance had faded. But during the centuries of turmoil, the city was never entirely forgotten. The local people knew that the site had been the residence of powerful kings and chiefs in earlier times, and they continued to use it for religious rites, even after they turned some of its enclosures into cattle pens in the 19th century. Today, recognized as a major archaeological site and an emblem of African civilization, Great Zimbabwe has reclaimed its place in history. And that's the end of our book tonight. Thank you so much for watching. I hope you found this video relaxing and educational. And I hope you have a very good night. Good night.